So what we're looking at is a pretty famous periodical that actually dates back to the turn of the century. It's called Collier's Magazine. When did I talk to you about Collier's in the past? Any prior knowledge? What kind of stories Collier's picked up? All right, you're on the right path. Collier's picked up a lot of investigative journalism, right? Muckraking articles, things of that nature. But they also picked up a lot of not just sort of muckraking style articles or investigative journalistic articles. They also picked up artists and cartoonists that used that style of sort of controversial art to depict events. So in this particular image, we have, and again, I'm using this as a teaching tool here. Obviously, it's a very racist, sort of stereotypical view of the Japanese being evil. And what is happening here in this primary document?
You got like flying monkey type of thing about to drop a atomic bomb.
Yeah, well, it's not atomic, but it's a bomb. But it is, yeah. What's the date?
1948.
Yeah, can you see that?
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, it's Pearl Harbor, good. December 7th, 1941. So again, this is a depiction of maybe Tojo dropping a bomb on Pearl Harbor and the start of World War II. So what we want to look here, what we're going to start with is just sort of military strength in the Pacific at the start of the war. One thing that I want to talk about is that we're not really including all the Allied military forces in other parts of the world, because we talked about the British being stretched way thin. Obviously the Dutch and the French, their military forces were stretched pretty thin too, and most French and Dutch fighters are either in exile fighting with the British or they're fighting with the resistance movement. So as far as battleships are concerned, Japan and the Allies match up pretty evenly there. Carriers, the lopsided difference in the carriers is going to be extremely important, because Japan has 11 carriers at the start of the war in the Pacific. The United States, they've got all 3 carriers. All 3 of the carriers belong to the United States at the start. Cruisers, Japan not only has more cruisers, but their cruisers are more advanced. The combined 37 cruisers, what do you think era cruisers those are, U.S., British, and French? World War I, right. They're like Clemson class, right? The ones we talked about before, those cruisers and destroyers are older. Destroyers fall in the same category as the cruisers. More advanced destroyers at the start of the war here, 129 at 93. Submarines, a little bit more of an even playing field, not only in development, but also in numbers, because we don't have a large-scale submarine program evolving until after World War I in the United States. I guess you could pull some of the British Q-boats into the mix, but most of those were out of commission by then. Army divisions, at the start, Japan has way more ground troops ready for invasion, as opposed to the combined Allied troops in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, that's going to ramp up dramatically. There's going to be a major effort to get soldiers trained and deployed out of the Pacific. And then airplanes, the Japanese Zero, this is the elite fighter, among other, we're going to look at the Japanese dive bomber today as well. The Japanese have way more planes in preparation in the Pacific than the United States. And think about this number, the number of 1,000 for the Allies. A lot of those planes that were U.S. British planes, a number of them were destroyed before they ever got off the ground in places like Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, British Malaya, Singapore, etc. Exactly. Michelle just said that. This is why ship production becomes so important as we enter the war in the Pacific. And we're going to look at those statistics a bit later on how the ship production and the naval production increased during the war. Another interesting thing that I'm going to bring into toward the end of the class is a war after the war on surplus, all the overproduction of goods and war preparation. I want to make this note. This is going to be a sort of a key point throughout this lesson. Aircraft carriers are the most important military unit in the Pacific. They're floating airfields capable of attacking enemy bases, and they are going to make the battleship obsolete by the end of the year 42. Obviously, the battleships are going to serve an important purpose, but the aircraft carriers are going to be the focal point of naval strategy in the Pacific. So, some points that I want us to take a look at that we're going to cover today. Obviously, Hawaii, proximity to Japan here. We've got Wake Island. One that's not on here, but I've got on my other map, is going to be Midway. It's located right here. We also have U.S. Philippines, U.S. Guam. Remember what war we gained those from? Spanish American. Good job. Spanish American. We have New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby. This is going to be strategically important for the U.S. to hold to prevent a Japanese attack on Australia, even though they will run bombing raids on Australia. And then, of course, the Battle of Coral Sea, which is going to be an important battle that we're going to discuss today as well. Yeah, of course. Go ahead. Just grab one of the passes right there. So, events are going to move pretty rapidly toward war between Japan and the United States by the fall of 41. So in early September, Japanese were determined to start mobilizing as a result of the embargo that we've already learned about on oil and steel that was passed by the United States. There's another thing that we did economically to Japan. Anybody remember what else we did economically to Japan? In recent years, you've heard this happening to some Russian officials and Russian tycoons that were attached to the Crimean incident in the last 5 years, 6 years. It's actually less, 5 years. 3 years. What did they place on some of those officials? Somebody say sanctions? So what type of sanctions did they do? What did they do with their bank accounts? They froze them, right? So Japanese assets were frozen in the United States as well. So as a result of this, the Minister of War, Hideki Tojo, starts to lay down the plan for the attack on Pearl Harbor. What is that operation known as? Operation Z. Good. Operation Z. I think somebody researched that, right? Isaiah? Yeah. All right. So diplomacy continues with the Japanese. In fact, the exact day that the Japanese set out for the attack on Pearl Harbor, November 26th, Secretary of State Cordell Hull meets with the Japanese delegation. Everything seems to be going just fine with keeping the peace in D.C., but in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, that will not be the case. Any questions there before we move on? So, here's Japan's war plan. Strike European colonial possessions in Southeast Asia and American territories. The Philippines, British Malaya, British Hong Kong, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, Wake, Guam. Did I already say the Philippines? Okay. Philippines are going to be tremendously important here. Strike American positions at Pearl Harbor, ultimately strike American position at Midway Island. Admiral Yamamoto wants to cripple the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, notably take out the carriers. That's the goal. Obviously, that's not going to be achieved, but other battleships and ships in port will be attacked. Yamamoto estimates that if there's a successful attack, America will move toward peace and will allow for Japanese predominance in the region. Yamamoto does not believe the United States or the Japanese will be able to defeat the United States in a long and drawn out war. So ultimately, the attack on Pearl Harbor and the success of destroying the Pacific Fleet, this really is a bit of a gamble. So the battle plan for the Japanese sort of laid out for you. Attack the Pacific Fleet at Pearl, launch attacks on Wake, Guam, French Indochina, British Malaya and Singapore, British Burma, British Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and the American Philippines. Centered assaults from aircraft carriers with formidable Japanese Air Force. Japanese Zeros are going to be the elite fighter in their Air Force or Air Corps. Element of surprise was essential to the entire operation. They are going to use strict radio silence, and they are going to travel a more northern route to what? All along the way, the only radio that they're trying to tap into is really the Hawaiian radio to determine whether, or the radio stations at Hawaii to determine whether anyone is aware of an attack. And that's not going to be the case. Believe it or not, a couple of guys doing experimental radar near Pearl Harbor picked up the fleet. They passed the word along to high command at Pearl Harbor, but were ignored because they didn't believe that there was going to be any attack launched on the weekend. So again, the Japanese conquest, if we take a look here, in 41, everything in blue, those are all U.S. territories or land holdings. So we're looking at Midway, Hawaii, looking at Wake, looking at Guam, U.S. Samoa, Philippines, and what really causes this is the Japanese need more raw materials for the war machine. The war machine needs coal, rubber, tin, wood, iron ore, oil, food, chemicals, notably steel and oil. That's the premise here. And that's a big reason why the Japanese launched these attacks in other parts of Asia. Another important thing to point out here is that really the embargo and the freezing of assets is what pushes forth this attack. Any questions about the map here? All right, so let's take a look at the attack on Pearl Harbor, Sunday morning, December 7, 1941. Why Sunday morning?
Because no one's working on Sunday.
Right. Everybody's in port, nobody's working, people are going to church.
People are hungover, they're chilling out.
Exactly.
No one.
That's a real issue, right? People have partied on Saturday night. Not everybody is pious. Maybe some people did decide to go to church regardless, but seriously, people are waking up surfing, right? Everybody's hanging out. There's one piece of Japanese intelligence that led them to launch this attack. And it wasn't about church, it wasn't about boozing it up, it was the fact that normally every weekend, the entire fleet was in port. That was the reason they chose Sunday morning. By a stroke of luck, and this is where the conspiracies come about, that's where they believe that Roosevelt may have known about the attack, because there is an operation where we have our carriers and other ships out to sea, but we still have our battleships and other ships in port. Yeah.
I know that there was supposed to be some sort of support fleet coming in that day, somewhere around that morning. So I know that when they picked up the planes on the radar, they're like, oh, that's our support fleet. It's all good.
You're exactly right. Yeah. So when the radar picked this up, they believed that it was a large-scale support fleet coming in, and it was not an imminent attack. So the Japanese attack obviously achieved complete surprise, totally destroyed the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma, and I know a number of you guys have been out there. You been out there this year? I want to get out there. That's a goal of mine. It's on my bucket list, for sure.
Awesome.
They disabled much of the U.S. fleet. U.S. air power was crippled. Most of the aircraft, well, the ships were important. Most of the aircraft were grounded at Wheeler and Hickam Fields. So there weren't many planes that were able to get off the ground. Victory, though, was not complete with the attack on Pearl, because there is going to be a massive component missing here. A large number of ships, notably the carriers, are out to sea. So the job was not completely done. And Admiral Nagamo does not launch a follow-up attack to try to attack the ships out to sea, because their carriers were now exposed. 2,403 Americans, soldier and civilian, were killed at Pearl Harbor. 19 ships were taken out of commission. 150 planes were destroyed. Again, most of those planes were on the ground. Japan followed up the attacks on French Indochina, British Malaya, attacking Singapore, U.S. Guam, British Burma, bless you, British Hong Kong. And one place I forgot to mention here, but I put it in the next part of the lesson, is the Dutch East Indies. So obviously the attack on Pearl Harbor inflicted horrible damage and officially pulls the United States into the war. Here we have another image. It's a little bit more clear and has been I believe it's called Technicolor, is the process that they use to provide color for the images. And then this is where I want to wrap up this part of the lesson, because I've got a clip I want to show you guys related to Pearl Harbor. The events in the Pacific for the remainder of 41, the Japanese invasion of Malaya. Singapore is at the bottom of Malaya. Instead of launching an assault on Singapore, they actually invaded Malaya and came down south. The British had a force of over 100,000 on Malaya and Singapore. They did not believe that the Japanese could get through the Malaysian jungle. Not only did they do that, they launched aerial assaults on the British, and nearly 90,000 British troops surrendered to the Japanese. This is the worst surrender, the most lopsided surrender for the British military in the entire war. Hey, what's up? Oh, thanks. Guam fell to the Japanese on December 11th. On December 17th, Admiral Chester Nimitz was given command of the entire Pacific Fleet. He replaced Husband Kimmel, who became the scapegoat of Pearl Harbor. He was the commanding officer in charge at Pearl. On December 23rd, Japan took U.S.-held Wake Island, which again is another American imperial possession. Major supply and gasoline depot, and a military base in the middle of the North Pacific. And then on Christmas Day, 1941, Hong Kong, under British rule, fell to Japan. So the empire is expanding very quickly within just a month, within the last month of 1941. And this is where we're going to pump the brakes for now. We've got FDR declaring war on Japan, December 8th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, right? So let's take a break here.